Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Robert Kay, and I'm delighted to give you a presentation trying to provide a bit of an overview to the field of additive manufacturing for electronic systems. Before I start my presentation, I wanted to give you a bit of a motivation, and I think Steve and Patrick have alluded to this. Why are we trying to bring everybody together? Well, basically, we're trying to address some real multidisciplinary challenges. So I'm really pleased that we've brought together the additive manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, and design communities together. One of the aims of this event is to educate, inform, and inspire. And I'm hoping we can do that through trying to show you the latest trends and recent advancements in the field. Furthermore, I think we need to identify the multidisciplinary challenges that are inhibiting the wider adoption of 3D printed electronics. I'm hoping that these 2 days, and particularly my presentation, help provide a bit of a platform to bridge the gap in terms of terminology. In many ways, the different communities are speaking different languages. It's important for us to each other collectively understand the research drivers and the requirements for industry to stimulate more collaborative research. The electronics industry itself is very diverse, and same with the additive manufacturing industry. I think we need to identify areas which we want to focus our efforts towards to generate the maximum benefit for society, the UK economy, and the environment. And lastly, it's very important that we broaden the engagement across industry, the research trade organizations such as the catapult centers and the universities. In terms of how we're going to achieve that, I think Patrick has covered the format for day one. Basically, what I'll just state is that we're combining a mixture of technical presentations with workshop sessions, i.e. breakout sessions. And this is our opportunity to try to collectively bring everybody together and discuss some of the main challenges and how do we address these challenges. In terms of what we're going to do today, we're going to identify some of these main challenges in separate breakout rooms. And then at the start of tomorrow's session, we'll actually vote for these. And that will determine the breakout sessions on the second day. And individuals attending, you're more than welcome to pick your preferred challenges and attend those sessions and contribute. What gives me the credibility to be the speaker at this event? Well, firstly, I'm very lucky that I've had both sides of experience. So my first half of my career was involved in electronics manufacturing, and my second half was in additive manufacturing. In fact, my first ever public talk was at an IMAPS UK annual Microtech event in 2003. So it's a real pleasure to see that come full circle again and have the IMAPS involved with this event. Basically, during my PhD, I developed a new manufacturing process that was capable of producing electroform stencils for electronic packaging applications. And because of the commercial benefits, the benefits to industry in terms of miniaturization, production costs, and yield, I ended up starting up a company called MicroStencil Limited and spinning that out from the university. And over a 7-year period, setting up a manufacturing base in the UK and also manufacturing partnerships both in Southeast Asia and China. What's great about this is it gave me the opportunity to see how you take university research and put that into, or to translate that out the laboratory into industry. I was lucky enough to see the big chip plants in North America and places like that, such as Intel. I was lucky to see the big electronics manufacturers in China and the large multi-layer board manufacturers in Europe and Taiwan. So this gave me a great appreciation of global electronics manufacturing. In 2012, I was really building up a fascination with 3D printing additive manufacturing, and I translated from industry back into academia. And I was feeling this disconnect of the forecast between people saying that 3D printing is the next revolution and what was realistically possible for the creation of electronics and other functional systems. So I really devoted my attention, my research to this area. And now I'm finding that we're working in such a range of applications from robotics, medical devices, wearable systems, communications, etc. And I think what's quite unique about our capability at Leeds and what we do within our group is that we specialize in building the machinery and the process development. So we don't buy equipment and just put a new material in it. We're able to build the equipment from the ground up, and that's a much more likely chance of being able to generate new technologies and new novel IP. I do apologize in advance that the next few slides, to some people, it might be stating the obvious, but part of the aim here is to bridge the gap between the two communities. So I just wanted to spend a few slides giving a bit of background to terminology and some of the drivers in the industry. So when we look at an electronic system, when we look at electronics, we should really note that it's not just a single constituent, a single component, but it's an assembly of different components. So typically that starts with a circuit board, commonly called a PCB or printed circuit board. And this substrate provides a platform for all the electrical routing so that all these different components can communicate with each other. In terms of components, you typically have things like integrated circuit. So these are things like the microprocessors, the memory, and other integrated circuits. Coupled with those, you get the additional functionality and the requirements that you need from discrete devices, such as passive components. So these are the small little, typically 2-pin components you'll see on boards that could be resistors, capacitors, or diodes. And then on top of that, if you think about modern products, like let's just say a smartphone, it's not just the electronics, but it contains things like sensors and actuators. So in that case, I'd categorize things like the camera that you'd have on your phone, or the accelerometer that determines that the phone's being tilted, or the display, or the antennas that do the communication. All of these components need to be placed onto the circuit board. And so when we talk about assembly and packaging of electronics, we're not talking about sticking electronics into a cardboard box. We're talking about how do we electrically and mechanically connect these components to the PCB. And when you bring all this together, that's basically what an electronic system is. Now, I think what we're going to find over the next 2 days is we're going to find some great examples of recent research where people are showing the ability to 3D print, additively manufacture certain aspects of the system. However, I think we're not quite there at the point where we're 3D printing all the elements together or within a single system. In particular, I doubt we'll see any examples of people producing directly silicon-based integrated circuits. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The technology is incredibly refined. So we're talking about, feature sizes in the nanometers. The cost to set up the manufacturing plants for this technology is in the fabs are in the billions now. But moreover, you can take these highly refined devices in their standard format, and by the architecture, the way you arrange them in terms of the routing, the signal, and also the software that you use allows you to get that personalization. So you can use these standardized components, but integrate them with the rest of the digitally fabricated system to get that bespoke personalization. Now, I'm certainly not going to explain to people what additive manufacturing is, because I'm sure that everybody at this event knows what it is. The main point to highlight is that additive manufacturing, or 3D printing, is not a single process. It's a range of processes. And so in order for us to better facilitate terminology, we can use things like the ISO ASTM standard for additive manufacturing, where they've basically produced 7 process categories, which easily allow you to group the different additive manufacturing processes into their respective relevant areas based on things like joining methods, type of feedstock, and aspects like that. One other thing I wanted to just highlight is that it gets a little bit of a blurred line, a little bit confusing when you talk about additive manufacturing, and then when you start to compare it against other digital fabrication techniques. So you can think about things like direct write processing. You might use inkjet printing or aerosol jet printing. Well, you might use material jetting, which is inkjet printing, within an additive process. furthermore, some of these digital techniques that you're using are not always additive. They might be subtractive, like CNC machining or laser-based processing. But it's important to note that these assistive processes are quite often a key part of producing 3D printed electronics. And they're also, if we're defining them as digitally driven, it means that they also fall into that same area of templateless production. And what I mean by that is that you don't need toolings or masks or something to get the production going. So I think that, albeit it's not a focus of the event, we need to take note, and some of the examples we'll see over the next few days will cover that. In terms of the market, the drivers, I mean, electronics are everywhere nowadays. They underpin so many industries: modern cars, aerospace, industrial systems, medical devices. You know, all of these require electronics. Electronics are a major driver for innovation and growth of the economy. And when we put it into the perspective of the UK electronics industry, in 2017, it was estimated to have an 8.4 billion gross value and a 19.4 billion turnover. So quite a large market. So, you know, people might want to post in the chat, or they might do this later on in the discussions. But I think that there's interesting questions that I certainly don't have the answer to, that maybe collectively we might be able to start to think about. You know, will additive manufacturing electronics accelerate growth of the sector, particularly in the UK? When you look at the diversity of the electronics industry and how many sectors it underpins, do we need to focus on certain areas? And furthermore, can we widen impact across a variety of industries? Also, when you look at emerging sectors, high technology growth areas, maybe something like autonomous vehicles or robotics, is it going to be these emerging sectors that benefit the most from AM of electronics? And if so, which ones? So like I said, I don't have the answers to these, but maybe other individuals might have some thoughts on this. What's the potential benefits of 3D printing electronics? Generally, additive manufacturing has been forecasted to revolutionize the way we manufacture products. It transforms the mindset from typically tooling or template mass production type methods to something which is fully autonomous during its manufacturing stage, and allows flexibility. So when we apply that to electronics, you could say you get increased complexity. Now, when I say complexity, I don't mean the complexity that you see on multi-layer circuit boards or that kind of density. What I mean is geometric complexity, moving from 2.5D to 3D. Obviously, if you don't need toolings and templates, it enables mass customization, plus facilitates things like rapid and iterative product development. If you're not having to have upfront tooling costs and templates, you have the potential for producing high value systems economically at low volumes. And some of the examples I think you're going to see over the next couple of days are also people trying to integrate additional capabilities such as cooling, electromagnetic shielding, or incorporating movement actuation. Another benefit is when you look at traditional electronics, typically they're produced on some sort of substrate, and that substrate that's assembled together is then placed into the package housing. Well, you could 3D print the package housing as part of the substrate. So in theory, you could do away with the extra printed circuit board within the actual device. And then finally, I think a big driver is the overall wider digital manufacturing vision. You know, you keep hearing these buzzwords like smart factories and things like that, but realistically, it's a convergence of all these digital techniques, and additive manufacturing can play a part in that. How are electronics currently additively manufactured? When I first started putting together this talk, I thought, you know, I'll put a really detailed literature review covering all these great advancements in the past 10 years. And I realized I'd need about 2 or 3 hours to cover the variety of work that's happened. There's just been an explosion of interest in the field. So rather than explaining every single technique that uses a combination with, for example, fused deposition modeling with inkjet printing, or stereolithography with aerosol jetting, or some other method of wire embedding and things like that, I'll try to explain to you the vision and the rough approach of how the research is going forward. So I've taken the image below from one of my colleagues, Matthew Shuttleworth at the University of Leeds, who produced this kind of concept image for their PhD to show you their vision of 3D printing based on their research. And this is quite a nice example because they're trying to demonstrate what a smart prosthetic could be. So you're seeing not only that you're printing the polymer aspect to the part, which is a geometric shape, but you're also trying to use other digitally driven processes to put down the circuitry, to place the components, to integrate sensing and potentially even movement. One of the big challenges around trying to achieve this is if you look at those 7 ASTM ISO process categories, if you look at the history of additive manufacturing, even multi-material systems, the majority of them are typically limited to a single material class, i.e. polymers or metals or ceramics, and don't often do the combination. Now you're going to hear some interesting examples about using material jetting as a single AM process, a kind of factory in a box, and that's going to be quite an interesting discussion around how you interleave those kind of conductors and the dielectrics. Another method of doing this isn't relying on one process, but looking to combine different techniques, either 2 additive manufacturing processes or additive manufacturing with secondary computer controlled techniques such as jetting or dispensing. It's also important to note that most of the examples you're going to see, you don't typically see them doing the 3D printing of the packaging. But then again, if you said, well, I've deposited solder paste and I've used a pick and place system to do that, you could say that's digitally driven, it's automated. So it still aligns to that vision. What I wanted to do today was just to give you a bit of a brief snapshot of some aspects of my research that relate to polymer electronics. It's the examples I'm going to cover are by no means completely, it's just a snapshot, I should say. And so my first example I'm going to start off with is combining advancements in material science and 3D printing to assist polymer electronics. My second example is looking at alternative materials, in this case, ceramic-based electronics for more demanding or harsh environment electronics. And then my final example is trying to indicate looking towards the future and how we might be able to spatially control the materials, not just to alter the conductors, but also to have some sort of control over the dielectric properties dynamically too. My first example that I'm covering starts with a 3D printing process that's quite common that most people will have heard of. It's a fused filament fabrication technique. And this is something that you see the home hobbyists using, and you see it used commonly by education institutions. And it's just a technique that deposits selectively or extrudes a molten thermoplastic. I also just wanted to highlight that this current work wasn't just conducted by the University of Leeds, but it was conducted in collaboration with Heriot-Watt University. Hopefully this video is playing okay. So what I wanted to do is give you a bit of an overview of the process. So here you can see the fused filament fabrication technique, depositing a material called polyetherimide. Polyetherimide is a great material because it's very stable. It can go to high temperatures, and it's got great properties for electronic applications. Once we've done the 3D printing of polyetherimide, we then do a chemical modification stage. In our case, we were using simple dipping methods, so just in a beaker. So if you look at any the imide polymers, so polyetherimide is one of them, but also probably more of you have heard of polyimide, also commonly sold under the trade name Captain. All of these contain this functional imide group. The importance of polyetherimide is it can be 3D printed. So what we're basically doing with this material is we're taking it and putting it in a very caustic solution, and we're basically cracking that imide ring. Oops. So once we've done the chemical modification and we've cracked this imide ring, we then immerse the material into silver nitrate solution. And what this does is it replaces the potassium ion with a silver ion. So we've now embedded silver into the polyimide structure. Once we've done that, we use light-based patterning. In our case, we're using a laser so it can be digitally driven. And where that light in the UV spectrum hits the substrate, it causes those metallic nanoparticles to reduce onto the substrate. We can then use traditional copper electroless plating that's used by the PCB industry to grow onto this silver. Once we've done that, we deposit the solder and we place the functional components. As you can see from this video, that's depositing firstly the solder paste, and then it's pick and place in the components. Once we've done all that, we put this into a reflow oven and we reflow the solder material to create the electrical and mechanical connections between the substrate and the component. So when we first started developing this process, the first thing we wanted to do was to see if we could actually get the copper to appear onto the substrate and to stick. So we just took commercially available polyetherimide filament, 1.75 millimeter diameter. We did this dipping process and then we shined a laser across it. And much to our delight, we were able to get pure bulk copper. The next question we had was, well, that's all great, but if you look at a typical fused filament fabrication or fused deposition modeling type process, you get the stair-stepping effect from each layer. So what we then started to do was test if we had electrical continuity, and we were very pleased to see that this worked very effectively and it was able to bridge any of these gaps from the stair-stepping. Furthermore, we noticed that the conductivity was very similar to what you've seen in current printed circuit boards, so about 2/3 the handbook value for copper, which is required for high-performance devices. The next thing we tried out was to see if we can make flexible circuits. So the way we did that was we just printed two very thin layers. In fact, the whole thickness of this is less than 100 microns, so it's about the thickness of a human hair. And we were very pleased to see that we could produce flexible substrates, and that we could get quite a high bend radius. But when you look at traditional printing of inks and paste onto 3D printed substrates, you might be able to get something that bends, but once you bend it a few times, the material starts to delaminate or the conductor cracks, so you get some other failure. So we wanted to validate this. So the next thing that we started to look at was to say, okay, well, let's bend test these structures. So what we did was we made rigid and flexible zones. And unlike traditional electronics manufacture, where you'd typically have a rigid board and a flexible board, for example, the hinge on a laptop, you'd have a flexible connector that goes around that so you can bend or fold the screen down, but you'd still have maybe a rigid motherboard within that laptop. When you look at the way that this is done, this provides points for, or the socket connection, I should say, is quite large, and it's potentially a point of failure. So we thought, well, maybe we could just omit these connectors. So we printed these rigid and solid parts. And then we bend tested these up to 50,000 cycles. So what you're seeing here is some of the samples. We tested 6 of them. And basically, we ran this 50,000 cycles, and all 6 samples were still functioning after the 50,000 cycles, both electrically and mechanically. But also, we've seen very little drift in resistance. So it indicated we're getting very good adhesion using this chemical modification approach, but also we're getting something that's very reliable. So we wanted to take this flexible approach a bit further and see if we could use it for sensing. So basically, we took these same sensors and we flexed them, and then we measured the changes in resistance. And we did this over 10,000 cycles, and we were very pleased to see very noticeable changes in resistance depending on the bend radius. So basically, this is acting like a strain gauge with a very large radius of curvature, this particular sensor. The next thing we wanted to look at was wireless communications. And so what we did was we fabricated a pill capsule antenna, that antenna on the screens, 11 millimeters in diameter. And we also fabricated the equivalent antenna in a planar format. Obviously, you can see that something wrapped around a cylinder is going to give you a much more compact format. So, for example, in this, we're envisioning an ingestible pill capsule that would allow something that might be to the format or the size that's required. We took this pill capsule antenna and we tested it up to 10 gigahertz. And the reason we tested up to 10 gigahertz is we wanted to cover many communication standards that modern electronic devices use. So things like Wi-Fi or the different mobile phone standards such as 3, 4, and 5G, and also the industrial, scientific, and medical frequency bands. What we found was that the performance was very good. It's important to note it's not just the conductivity of the copper that matters here, but it's also the dielectric performance of the underlying substrate. So we got a close agreement with the simulations, and we found that this would potentially offer a route going forward to producing high performance antennas. One thing to note is that when you're looking at 3D printed, or I should say material suppliers from the industry, the few that give the dielectric properties will only list the properties up to 1 kilohertz, which isn't very useful when we're trying to go into the gigahertz regime. So there are some of these other ancillary challenges still out there. Another thing is that our process is a little bit ad hoc, I guess you could say, in terms of how you do the design, the simulation, and the manufacturing. And it would be great to see a much more joined up approach. The next thing we looked at is wireless charging. You imagine we're talking about using 3D printing of electronics for medical devices or robotics and things like that. Routes to do wireless charging would be very, very beneficial. So what we did with this particular example is that we fabricated your typical inductive planar RF coil. We fabricated 2 of these. And in order to make this one work, we needed to have a return path. So just like conventional electronics, we had to have a conductive Z-axis connection, also commonly called a via. We were able to easily hit 2 out of 3 of the wireless standards, but there was a bit of loss on the key standard, which is commonly used in the mobile phone industry and other areas. But more recently, we've shown that if you increase the turn ratio there, that you should be able to easily hit that standard. The examples I've shown you so far, they only really cover examples that don't have components attached to them. So the next stage we wanted to see was, could we use solder surface mount assembly? So when I talk about surface mount, what I'm referring to from the electronics industry is a method of attaching the components directly onto the substrate rather than using through-hole or other methods. This is a highly refined approach. It's driven the boom in contract electronic manufacturing, and it allows very fast and reliable and repeatable ways of making connections. We started with a very basic 555 timer circuit, but we found that the board would withstand the solder reflow and the LED would flash. So we then wanted to take this a bit further. So the next thing we wanted to look at was common electronic components, and there's a big variety of them out there. And if I started to use some of the acronyms, I think I'd probably lose half the audience because of the number of different package technologies. Basically, what we tried to do was cover a range of different modern components, including passive devices. And when you look at modern passive devices like an 0201, they're virtually down to the size of a grain of sand. So we produced our substrates, as you can see in the top left there, with a copper. Then we dispensed a solder paste. In this case, we wanted to use what the industry uses. So we used a lead-free solder paste, and we used the most predominant, the tin, silver, copper. And we printed this paste, deposited it, and then we put the substrate into the oven to see wettability and other things. And we were very delighted to see that the initial results showed the solder fully wetting, but not only that, that the substrates were surviving the reflow process, because the glass transition temperature polyetherimide is not much higher than the tin, silver, copper solder paste we used. What we also did was obviously place these components. Now this is really early results. If you look at the way that the electronics industry do their testing, what I'd ideally like to see going forward is that we do some sort of thermal cycling, accelerated age testing. I'd like to see what they call daisy chain connections, so we can interrogate electrically the devices and use other kind of reliability testing, like shear testing or drop testing, to ensure that this technique has as a benefits to the industry. And then lastly, what we did was we decided to try to incorporate some form of actuation that did not use electric motors. So in this case, we incorporated a shape memory alloy, a nitinol, into the circuits. And what we did was we printed rigid and flexible areas, and then we used the same technique to produce the circuits we used to produce selective heating elements. And really what we're wanting to look at here is in the future, can we make foldable or deployable electronics? The nice thing about the approach here is most individuals, when they use a shape memory alloy like nitinol, muscle wire as it's commonly called, they directly attach the current to the wire. So the Joule heating directly goes through that wire, and it does not enable any selectivity. Because we printed these discrete elements, it allows us to do some forms of selective actuation. And this slide shows you how, depending on what segments we turned on or turned off, determined the movement of that part. And the two images I'm showing below, the one on the bottom left is looking at some sort of origami type robotics, and the bottom right is maybe what might be potential with prosthetics in the future. Now, we have to be quite honest here that this looks great, shape memory alloys and motorless actuation, but the actuation speed is incredibly slow, and there's other issues around the temperatures and the energy that's required to run some of these systems. So I think we've still got a long way to go with this. The next example I wanted to show you is producing ceramic electronics. So most people will probably think of polymer electronics, but actually when you look at challenging or demanding applications, for example, under the bonnet of a car, or in an aerospace application, or something where you need really high frequency requirements, then or high power requirements, you're seeing ceramic substrates being used. Now, a lot of the industry is used to hearing words like low temperature coal-fired ceramics and high temperature coal-fired ceramics and things like that. But basically, it's devices with a substrate is a ceramic, and the conductor layer is some sort of conductor with typically a glass composition in it. One of the challenges with 3D printing of ceramics is the methods that have been employed mean that you're basically modifying or altering materials to get them to work in existing processes. And that typically has trade-offs in the density, the types of materials you can process, the porosity, and other aspects. So what we decided to do was to develop a hybrid approach, which is both additive and subtractive. So looking at depositing and machining, and combining these in a layer-based technique. So we produced our own bespoke machine that has these different process modules. We integrated it all together. And we were delighted with the results, because basically what we were able to get was very similar or identical results to individuals who are mass producing engineered ceramics at the moment. And one of the nice things about this hybrid approach, I think you can see graphically here, is that you get over that effect of putting individual layers and that stair stepping by basically being able to produce the near net shape, but apply machining to get you much closer to your requirement. You might say, well, how do we make electronics from this? This is a ceramic, it looks like a dielectric. So basically what we did was we produced these ceramic substrates, and then we used a direct write dispensing process to put the conductors down. Rather than reinventing the wheel, we used silver-based materials that you find in the low temperature coal-fired ceramics industry. We're able to make successful circuits, and these circuits should be able to, in theory, operate at very high temperatures. You probably noticed on the slide where we're putting the conductor down that we're using a 3-axis Cartesian system. that certainly has some limitations and maybe some of the advantages of moving to additional degrees of freedom, like a 5-axis system, or being able to control the motion of the substrate and kinematically linking that to the deposition head will give additional complexity with the manufacturing. The last example I want to finish up with today is looking to the future. So if anybody's ever looked at antennas that you'll find in a mobile phone or other things, you find that the designers are typically quite limited with their design freedoms. Now sometimes they might get something where they can make a 2.5 or a 3D shape, but typically their bulk substrate is a homogeneous material, that dielectric medium. So there's a design opportunity potentially here. When you look at certain digital fabrication processes, such as additive manufacturing, you'll notice that some of them are allowing precise spatial control of materials. So if you're able to control the material placement and not just the conductor, you might be able to dynamically alter the effective permittivity of the substrate. And this leads to whole new design freedoms that are relatively untapped. I mean, it leads into things like producing meta materials or meta devices. So with this seminal work, what we did was basically use a commercially available stereolithography process, and we placed different levels of air inclusions within these. And we measured the effective permittivity. And what we were able to show was by changing the volume air fraction, you could dynamically change the permittivity. Now, this is quite a basic example here, but it shows you that tunability. Now, if you brought that forward, instead of just using air inclusions, but say use metal inclusions or other materials, you could get a much wider range of the changes in that permittivity. Just before I finish up, I just have a few points to make and potentially questions that might help stimulate debate today. I'm not saying these are the grand challenges to electronics. These are the obvious barriers that might inhibit current additive manufacturing production of electronics. So, you know, if you look at an electronic system nowadays, a modern mobile phone or something, they are incredibly complicated. And that's because you've had a constant technical evolution over 50 years. So at the moment, the performance of conventional electronics is much greater than additive manufacturing electronics. And you know, you can see that example on the bottom right here of the density of a design. You know, look at all that circuitry and the routing of that round to join up all those components. That is incredibly complicated. Other issues around the speed of 3D printing, the issues around quality and reliability, and also some of these main design challenges. Now, I don't have answers to these questions today, but I do have some examples of other areas in the fields or other suggestions that might stimulate some responses. When we look at the performance of 3D printed electronics, you could arguably say it's like going back to the 1970s in terms of the capability. If you don't have the same conductivity of the conductor level, if you can't get the same fidelity in terms of resolution, then you're limited by the types of components you can package, the density of the boards. So therefore, what you do is you end up using larger components. Also, some of the materials that are used are typically low temperature materials. Also, when you look at things like the conductivity, if you have a trade-off in conductivity, you'll have issues with the speed that the circuit can run, or the power consumption will go up. So all of these impact functionality. So really my question today to everybody is, what do we need to do to improve the performance of electronics so they can compete with conventional electronics? Another area is process speed and throughput. You know, you look at 3D printing of electronics, and you know, some of these techniques to produce a single part might take hours or longer. How does that work if you want to scale up or produce anything in volume? I don't know the answer to this, but if we look at some of the aspects in the wider additive manufacturing industry, maybe we can start to take inspiration. In recent years, you've seen some nice examples of moving from a fixed platform where after every print you would take the part out to continuous printers, things using things like conveyor belts, and you've seen it in binder jetting, and there's been a recent flurry of activity in the fused filament fabrication market. So are things like this where you can just run the printer 24/7, will that help? Most of 3D printing is what I'd call a sequential process. So it means that you trace out each element of the layer and then you build it up layer by layer. There's very few examples of what you call parallel processing of a layer. Probably the most common example is using a digital light projector chip from Texas Instruments, so a DLP, and that's seen in stereolithography approaches. Sometimes some of them use a laser, but that's patterning a whole layer at once rather than in a sequential process. And you're seeing that the emerging techniques like the continuous liquid interface production technique by Carbon 3D, they're also using a DLP to flash the whole layer at once. Convergence of digital technologies. You know, additive manufacturing is only one part of the puzzle. How do we bring all these together? You know, all the buzzwords around digital twins and the increase in generative design and all these things. Can we capitalize on that? What about reliability? You know, if you look at modern electronics, they are tested, quite often destructive testing. They'll put a whole bunch of them into some sort of environmental cycling. And so they have a good indication of how they will perform and if there's going to be issues where that will occur. How do we do this on one-off designs? We don't want to destroy a one-off design and have to make two of them just to test it. 3D printing's always had documented trade-offs in terms of mechanical performance due to the layer-based approach. How do we get that same reliability? Also, if you're using a trade-off of materials, like lower temperature polymers that can't withstand traditional packaging processes. So all of these things need to be looked at to make sure we can meet real world applications. Do we want to reduce assembly? One of the examples I showed you before was getting rid of rigid and flex. I'm not sure if that is a good idea or not, but when you look at modern mass-produced systems, they might benefit from the modularity, freedom in design of having subcomponents. It can improve reliability by making subcomponents and then assembling them afterwards. It can also reduce manufacturing costs. So do we want to reduce assembly? And just last couple points here. Design, how do we move from 2.5D to 3D? How do we achieve greater integration of the mechanical and electrical systems? How do we translate the drivers in electronic design and manufacturing? You know, in electronics, they want performance. They want the most portable, the most power efficient, all of these things. How do we translate it across? And then lastly, I've been to a number of events over the years, and people always talk about killer applications and what's going to drive the additive manufacturing market. When you look at the electronics global market, I think for consumer goods, it's something like 400 billion at the moment, roughly. Yes, that industry has had continuous advancements technologically in 50 years. But realistically, what's driven the growth in the market has been new products, new concepts. So it ranges from the calculator all the way up to, you know, the modern smartphone or wearable devices. So is that what's going to drive it? You know, surely we don't want to be additively manufacturing everything that's currently produced through traditional methods. We need new applications, new areas where we get the benefit, the value. So in conclusion, 3D printing, additive manufacturing is a rapidly developing field. I think there's tremendous future potential. But what do we need to do to get there so we can achieve the performance and reliability required for real world applications? Also, how do we bridge that gap between the requirements of electronics industry and the drivers of the additive manufacturing industry? Thank you very much. And I just want to acknowledge the EPSRC for their funding and also the collaborators, in particular at the University of Leeds and Heriot-Watt University. Patrick, I haven't been able to monitor the chat. Was there anything that didn't come up?
Thank you, Robert. No, I think there haven't been that many messages. I think Alan was monitoring the chat, and I think he answered a couple of questions. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think it was very informative, and the questions especially, I think they were very, very interesting to trigger the discussion of what could be the future, future research directions and the grand challenges within this discipline. Has been a really informative presentation.
Thank you.
So are there any questions from the attendees? I think Richard has sent a question in the chat. I was just Richard and Andrew, I think they are praising the presentation. Hi, Richard.
I do have a question, actually, Patrick, if I may jump
thanks.
in. Hi, Rob. Good to see you.
Hi, Richard.
Rob, one of the things you didn't mention there was sustainability and end of life, and I'm sort of wondering about how recyclable, reusable these things are at the end of life. With the polyetherimide and the various coatings and things, and also once things become three-dimensional, they become more difficult to separate, perhaps. Is it? I think that's one of the challenges. Is that anything that's being done at Leeds? Do you know people who are working on end of life and the implications of that?
I think you're raising a really good point here, Richard, around the recyclability and the use of the materials. We've certainly not looked at it from our research perspective, but one of my I guess one of my goals when I speak to the community is I realize that there's been lots of selling additive manufacturing has been very environmentally friendly and sustainable. But actually, when you drill down on it, it quite often is not at the moment. In terms of the recyclability, if you're starting to use bulk metals like copper, if you're starting to use the same materials that the industry is using, engineered thermoplastics, then you do aid the recycling compared to these materials that are produced that we don't really know what the ultimate constituents are. I certainly think we're a long way off being able to recycle what we've been doing in the lab. But I think you raise a really good point there, that is a challenge that the industry is facing.
Yeah, it's just the one reason, obviously, to raise it as a question is also to prompt it to everybody else here today to say, well, there's one of the challenges that this group might want to take on.
Great, I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was definitely a great point. You can see Ajit that is raised his hand. Yeah. Hi, Ajit. Nice
hi, Patrick. Thanks for organizing the network. I'm sorry I only joined very recently, but it's nice to see such a large community. And thanks, Rob, for the lovely presentation. I was particularly interested with the bend test that you had shown, where you kind of demonstrated loss of performance. And I was interested, was there any mechanism with which you were able to recover this, or was this a permanent loss in performance?
Oh, okay. So when we showed the drop in performance, it was less than 1% over 50,000 cycles. So I think when you're bending a copper, the way that the grain boundaries and the way that the ductility changes, that it's quite common to see that across the electronics. Actually, to myself, 50,000 cycles with less than 1% shows very little degradation in that performance. So I don't see it as an issue at the moment, to be honest.
Brilliant. And perhaps I'll have an opportunity to chat with you later, but I have previously done some work on design optimization for multifunctional materials, by effectively looking at embedding electronics in structures, and never found adequate experimental evidence, which is what I think you have very nicely shown today. So I think it would be nice to have a chat on that front with you at some point.
That would be excellent. Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk further.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit.